Start doing yard work in there.
And right. All right, so I've been asked to give a talk today on the use or the transition of ammunition and rifles from the 1860s era 58 caliber guns to the 50 caliber, which completely the whole world switched to 45 caliber in the 1870s. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the 1880s. But this talk is focused almost entirely on the 1870s and how the world across the board made that switch from the 58-ish caliber to the 45 caliber. Right? So why did that switch happen? Well, we got a couple of things occurred. There were a couple of wars that happened. One of them being the American Civil War, right? The Austro-Prussian War, right? And of course, in 1870 itself, the Franco-Prussian War. And all of the lessons learned from all of those just led to this pretty rapid change. I kind of do an analogy of the changes that occurred in the 1870s. So if you're familiar at all with the world of fighter planes, right? The 1950s is this massive transition of technology. You start the 1950s with propeller planes, and you end the 1950s with supersonic jet fighters and all the things that came along with it. So a similar thing occurred in the militaries of the world, with the 1870s kind of being a big part of that. But of course, it transitioning all the way to 1900 with other technological changes that came into play. So the armies of the world were doing this complete transition of firearms every decade during that period. So why 45, right? So first of all, the ballistic path of the 58 with the standard loads of the day and the standard guns of the day, it's been described as rainbow-like trajectories, right? Which made any kind of long-range shooting difficult. While the rifles and ammunition were capable of doing long-range shooting, right? Oftentimes the infantrymen were not capable of doing long-range shooting, right? Range estimation had to be so perfect because when you think about that arch, if you're trying to get that arch to hit, it's called the danger zone, where it actually hits a target. If you're off by just 50 meters in your estimation, you're completely missing. Even though the bullet is very accurately going where you pointed at it, right, you're not hitting your target. So one of the things that had to happen was that arc needed to be brought down, all right? And the other thing that, of course, was happening, especially as an outcome of the American Civil War, was a wholesale move to breech loaders. While the Americans didn't actually adopt many breech loaders during the Civil War, but the technology was all being put in place during the Civil War. And again, the armies of the world were also all looking at this, right? So, but breech loaders had a fundamental problem. All of the Civil War breech loaders and breech loaders of the world had a problem of the gas seal. So when you fire the gun, how do you prevent the gas from going back out the breech? Right, so there were a number of rifles that had different answers to that. Going way back to the Ferguson, which had this whole screw block, which kind of completely blocked off the breech. The Hall's rifle in the United States, the Kammerlader in Norway, those all had various forms of trying to get the breech to close, but it never fully stopped the thing. If you want to see some of the best slow motion videos, just watch a video of a Hall rifle going off and the volcano of flames coming out of the breech. So, and then guns like the American Smith carbine made an attempt through obturation by using either a rubber cartridge or a paper and foil cartridge, which when it fired would open up and obturate to try to prevent that gas from going. But ultimately the answer to the gas breech problem in a breech loader is the metallic cartridge, where the metallic cartridge itself is the thing that opens up and fills the breech. All right, so we are going to talk about the various forms of cartridges and why they are the shapes they are as well to part of that problem. So during the same period as the big kerfuffle in the United States, there were some gentlemen at Wimbledon who were doing target shooting. And David, could you bring over the WATTWORTH? Okay, so where does the 45 come from? Well, really, this is a replica Whitworth of the period, right? Very nice replica. And this is a 45.1, 451. So good enough, 45. Well, we're talking about 45 here, just to be clear. Not all of these things are 0.50 inches. We go over from 0.3 inches to 0.78 inches, but we're just going to call them all 45s, all right? But the Whitworth really was renowned as a very accurate rifle in the target range. It still used pretty much the same powder charge, right? But because the bullet was lighter, right, its trajectory was flatter, and therefore, while not necessarily inherently more accurate in the bullet, but way more accurate to aim. So accuracy, of course, there's the inherent accuracy of the gun, and then there is, what can the shooter do with it? So we have the origins really of the 45. So thank you, David. All right. So the next big kerfuffle that happens is the thing that convinces all of Europe that we have to go to breech loaders, and that's the Austro-Prussian War, where the Austrians were going in with the Lorenz rifle, and the Prussians were going in with the Dreiser needle rifle. And of course, the Dreiser is a breech loader, all right? A very complicated bullet to make, relatively delicate firing pin in the needle, so it wasn't perfect. It inherently was not necessarily as accurate either. You could argue that the Lorenz rifle is actually a more accurate rifle than the Dreiser rifle, but the Dreiser rifle combined with Prussian tactics produced a positive result for the Prussians at the end of the war. And that was really the thing that convinced armies of Europe we have to go to breech loaders. So everyone's in a rush to go to the breech loader. So the first answer to how do we go to a breech loader is to use what we got, right? And the armies of the world did that. We'll start with one of the most common, which is the Snider action. So the Snider, this is just a P53 Enfield rifle where they cut the back of the barrel off and put in a new breech. It's called a shoe, right? And have a door that opens to put the metallic cartridge in and close. Now the metallic cartridge, the nature of it being metallic, right, malleable metal, when it goes off, the metal actually obturates, opens up to prevent gas from going back. Right? There is a huge, machining-wise, gap actually between these two pieces. All right? If you were to not use a metallic cartridge in there, all that fire would be coming out here, and every time you shoot it, it would burn more and more of it away. But the metallic cartridge itself seals it up. But this is still a 58 caliber weapon, or 5.577 to be technical, all right? So they didn't change the barrel. They didn't even change the powder charge. So the powder charge that's in a Snider is the same powder charge that would have been used in the muzzle loading Enfield. Right? So ballistically, this is still the same as the P53 Enfield rifle. Right? So you haven't solved that problem yet. But you've got a lot of P53 Enfields floating around and a relatively cheap conversion in the Snider system. So at the same time, then worldwide, everyone was making this kind of a fix. In the United States, the Allen conversion was the big one, which leads to the trapdoor. We're going to talk about the trapdoor in a minute. Now that one, they started out with a 58, but very quickly, right, went from the 58 to a 50 caliber, and they did that by boring out the barrel of their surplus Civil War Springfield rifles and putting a 50 caliber liner into it, and then doing the conversion to the trapdoor. It's very similar to this. I didn't actually bring one of these today, but it's a system almost identical to this on a later purpose-built Springfield trapdoor. All right, other quick examples we have of that are the Austrian Wanzel rifle. So this is derived off of a Austrian Lorenz rifle, and it too is very similar to the trapdoor in that it has a pretty massive breech that opens up. This feels definitely more Germanic, right? A little more massive, right? But it's a similar situation. Same big bore caliber as the Lorenz. And just for giggles, we'll also talk about the worst one ever made, the Needham rifle. This is another. This is a Springfield 1863 or 62, made in Bridesburg. Almost all these were Bridesburg. And these were made for the Fenians, so a group of Irish in the United States who felt compelled to invade Canada. And on their second invasion in 1870, they decided that they needed to have a breech loader. And they had these made for them. And quite a dreadful system, actually. So they're similar to the Snyder. They cut off the back, put this breech in, and bullet goes in, closes shut, and extracts. But there's all kinds of issues using this. Anybody who's ever fired one of these knows about the issues. While they're very cool, but as a shooting rifle, don't lead much. And there's a reason the only group that ever used them was the Fenians, and not very successfully, mind you. All right, but now we actually have cartridge guns. And another issue with the obturation, right, that's to prevent the gas from blowing by, is what is the shape of your cartridge going to be? So and it got even worse as you're putting higher pressures behind it, right, the shape of the cartridge itself matters to aid in obturation. So we now have late 1870s, we're beginning to get to the period where we're going to realize, because of the Whitworth in the 45, that we can get shorter or less of an arc on our bullets, higher velocities, similar powder charges, right? And just for example, most of the 45s had a muzzle velocity between 1,300, 1,400 feet per second, while the things that we're replacing was around 900 to 1,000 feet per second. So you reduce that arc by quite a bit, retain the accuracy, right? But now everyone in the world is rushing to make, what is that going to next thing look like? So we had the conversions, the Snyder, the Allen, the Vansel. There are many others. Every country had theirs. The French had the tabbies, right? So now we're going down to we decided to do the 45 and cartridges. So I'm going to actually start with the Martini Henry. It's actually in my opinion, one of the better of the designs. And the Martini Henry uses it's called a 5.77-450 cartridge, because it was literally based on the 5.77 Snyder case. The assembly of the base of the case is identical to the Snyder. The forming of the case itself is similar, except that, of course, it had formed, they did a neck. So the neck has two purposes. In the case of the Martini Henry, the purpose they can maintain that shape, the original size of the base, and then neck it down to the 45 caliber bullet. The side effect out of that, though, is a necked case obturates better, right? So the blow-by, that neck opens up first, sealing the breech right away. And so what you will see is only one of these is a straight wall cartridge. All of the others are some form of a necked cartridge. And again, that aids in the obturation. It also aids in getting enough powder into the case. Right? And again, what 45-70 we'll talk about in a moment, it's a kind of a variant away from it. All right. So, but the Martini Henry, its story actually begins with the Peabody rifle. This is an American design, patented in 1862. So the patent for the Peabody is during the Civil War. The U.S. is busy with their fight they're having, so it never gets built or adopted. But after the war, one of the first countries was looking, that actually already had a solution, but it was going to take a while to build it. So as an interim, they were looking at potentially using this, and that's Switzerland. Right? And the main designer who was looking at this, his last name happened to be Martini. So if you look at this action, All right, and you can all come up and take a look closer. This is very much a Martini action. All right, so, or sorry, it's a Peabody action, but the Martini Henry, then they learn from it, and the main thing that they do between the actions is make the hammer internal. So it's actually striker fired. So this is actually more similar to a Glock than to one of these. So it's a striker fired system inside. But that's nice because they eliminated a step. And you'll see that all of the other rifles of the 1870s had an additional cocking step, except for maybe the Mauser. So this is all one operation: eject, load, close, and your rifle is loaded and ready to fire. So the Peabody then gets very limited use I don't think it gets any use actually in Switzerland that I'm not aware of. But it does get adopted by a few other countries, Spain and Turkey. Actually, Spain was the main one, sorry. Turkey adopts the Martini Henry that was actually made by Peabody. So a Peabody Martini Henry. The Peabody itself is mainly adopted by Spain and by a number of South American countries and by a few American National Guard units. So this particular one here is one of those. This is a Connecticut National Guard Peabody. So they adopted it. Nice thing about this is in a commonly 45-70 round, which makes it very much more approachable to shoot as a collector and shooter. All right, America. All right, we already talked a little bit about the trapdoor. So you'll notice here, you still have the Peabody you still had to do the action of cocking. So here's the same thing: cock, eject the round is in there, load in a new one, close it, bring it to full cock, shoot. So that additional step. The Martini is the one that doesn't have that additional step. Right? This is a purpose-built, so in the 1870s, the Americans then no longer converting Civil War era Springfields. These are now purpose-built. So the stocks are a little bit narrower. The barrel is 45. And it's got the world's most complex sight on it, the Buffington sight. It's actually an 1880s sight, so we're a little bit off there. Still, it's a very solid system. All right, you can fire relatively quickly, maybe not as quickly as some of the others, but it's a very solid system. And these served in the U.S. military basically from 1873, this style, all the way up until the adoption of the Craig in the early 1890s. All right, Austria. So we already saw the Wanzel rifle. The Austrians adopted this beast. And again, very Germanic, very heavy, very massive. But this uses it's called the Tabernacle Action. And again, this also is a purpose-built. This one is it's roughly a 43 caliber. All right, but it's purpose-built. This isn't a conversion of another rifle. This is one that's designed specifically for it. And this one is similar to a Snider once you open it. The main difference is ejection comes from pushing it all the way, which fires an ejector off, which sends the cartridge just flying out the back. So the Snider action, for example, you had a separate action to pop the round, then you had to physically dump the round out, where this fully ejects the round. So quite a robust rifle, and they're famous for being robust. All right, and once again, we're going to go back to Germany. And the Germans, after they realized their vaunted Dreiser rifle was not all that good anymore either, they went to the first bolt-action, Mauser bolt-action rifle. So this looks really modern in many ways, but this is a single-shot rifle. So open it, round comes out, round goes in, and it's cocked. So it seems like it might be faster than a Martini, but I actually think a Martini is slightly faster in actual use. All right, but beautifully made, amazingly made rifles. We call it 43 Mauser caliber, so it still falls in that category. And these served in the German army for a period of absolute peace, which is why so many of them are in such beautiful condition. All right, what I don't have is something representative of the major powers of Europe. All right, I don't have a French rifle, and that would be the Gras. It's it's also a bolt gun, very similar. And I also don't have the Berdan 2, which is the same thing with the period. So that would be the Russian entry. So what if you weren't a major power of Europe with its own inherent firearms industry to produce weapons? What did you do? Well, the rest of the world pretty much went to the Remington rolling block. So you'll find these in every country that needed an army with guns but didn't have a manufacturing base. So this particular one is an Egyptian, right? And it's, well, this one is really beat up, so the trigger doesn't really work. Yeah, but it killed. So you had to choose up, you cock it, pull the rolling block back, put the bullet in, close it, and you're ready to shoot. Its huge advantage, though, is its utter simplicity. I think what there's in the action, there's like 6 parts in the action. So beautifully designed gun, very simple to use, very simple to produce. So this is the AK-47 of its era. All right, the rest of the world used something like this. So you'll find these in the Danes use them, the Norwegians use them, Spanish use them. I already said the Egyptians, just all over the place. So, all right. There's one other, though, arms producing nation. It was actually at the very beginning of all this, and they are truly the outlier, and that is Switzerland. So when Switzerland had a design of a rifle in 1867, it was very advanced. But it was going to take them a while to build it, which is how the Peabody Martini Henry story started, was because Switzerland needed an interim rifle, and they were going to use one of those as an interim to the Vetterli rifle. So this is an 1867 design. It's actually, as I'm calling it, outlier because it's in 41 caliber. So that's even smaller than what we're talking about. But it has a number of very interesting features. One, it is a repeater, bolt action, and it is a repeater. All right. So there's a tubular magazine. All right. You fill it up. The action is very much a Winchester action in terms of its loading. It has a side loading gate, much like a Winchester. And there's some things about how the vaunted Swiss Patent Office, this was before the Swiss Patent Office existed, and they were pretty blatant about just taking the Winchester's patent. Way ahead of its day. So here we have a repeater in a smaller caliber available and firing a similar velocity starting in 1867. All right. Now, of course, it's Switzerland, so it doesn't get much military use, but their neighbors to the south, the Italians, adopt it, but they didn't want this whole repeater thing. So the Swiss, the Italian Vetterli is similar to this, but doesn't have the magazine and the repeater. So they go through the entire 1870s with what the rest of the world was doing, which was single-shot rifles. All right, so in terms of actual military use, all right, it ends up that the 1870s, after the Franco-Prussian War, where neither side had modern 45 caliber rifles to start out with, was a relative time of peace on the continent. All right, the major powers didn't fight each other directly. So where did these guns actually get used? All right. The most famous of those was the Martini Henry, which served as the main rifle of empire during the Victorian period. So the Zulu Wars is, of course, the main thing we know of today. And many of us are probably into this hobby as a whole because of 2 movies made in the 1960s and 1970s, Zulu and Zulu Dawn. I happen to know that's what really got me wanting a Martini Henry back before they were commonly available. All right. The Americans used them to a limited extent in the Indian Wars. They used the trapdoor. The rolling block was used probably in combat more than any of them. Example of that would be the Egyptians and various offshoots using it to fight English. I forget the name of a big battle that occurred in the what? Yes. Say that again aloud. Omdurman, yeah. Where the Egyptians were armed. And then there are also the Mahdists. They overran a large Egyptian unit and armed themselves with these. So later on, when the British are fighting against the Mahdists, they're using Martinis against rolling blocks. That may have actually even been Lee Metfords by that point. Yeah. So, but in the 1870s, 1880s, the next thing that happens is the repeater. Everyone has to have a repeater. So one of the first would have been, and I didn't bring it with me, but is the Mauser Model 71. They built a new version based on the 71, not converted from a 71. They are entirely different guns. All right, they share almost no parts in common. But they built one that had a magazine tube. So that became in the 1870s, that happened. The Americans looked at them in the form of the Remington Lee. All right, and the U.S. Navy adopted a few. But the Remington Lee, of course, goes on to become the Lee Enfield, a rather successful rifle. And what other repeaters do we have? The Lee Metford, Long Lee, is kind of comes a little bit later. So the British really went from a single shot to a smokeless, because in the 1890s, the smokeless powder takes over. The United States also skipped the black powder repeater as well. So the Americans go from the single shot trapdoor to the Craig Jorgensen in a smokeless caliber. The Germans do the Mauser, which only exists for a few years. 1884 to 1888 is so then the Germans adopt the 1888 repeater. We do have one here. This is the Mannlicher. Good. 1895. So this is what replaced the Verndl, and it's a straight pull repeating bolt action. So it's magazine. And then finally the next thing that happens, of course, is smokeless powder combined with the next reduction in caliber. So you have smokeless powder giving you even higher velocities, combined with an even smaller bullet giving you even more higher velocities. So if you look at ballistics charts, when you compare the 45-70 to a 58 caliber bullet, you have the huge arc of the 58. You have less of an arc of the 45. But what really, when you go to the smokeless 30 caliber rounds, you go from, if you do the same thing, then you have to show it scale-wise, a huge arc for the 45 and more flat out. And that's also where you go from 1,400 feet per second to 1,600, 2,000 feet per second and higher. So the caliber reduction then stops at 30 caliber for quite some time. All the armies of the world go to some form of 30 caliber. Again, with some minor variations. The Germans are slightly bigger than 30 caliber. And also how you define 30 caliber, is it the bore size or is it the groove size? So you have the British 308, the American 30-06, the Russian 7.62 by 59. They're all, just like these 45s, right? They're all conceptually similar rounds, right? Okay. Circling back around, one last thing on the 45, and that is the cartridges themselves. With the exception of the trapdoor, all of the cartridges are necked cartridges. Again, that does two things. It aids in obturation, and it also allows you to get that nominally 60 grain of fine powder load, right? The 45-70 takes 70 grains of that same powder in a case that is much smaller than the European cases, not neck, straight walled. Right. Now the nice thing about the trapdoor is it actually locks up very tight. All right, and they found that the obturation was enough on the 45-70 to not have blow by, but to load it, so a 45-70 is a compressed charge. So the process of making a 45-70 round is way more difficult. All right, so like in the Martini Henry, if you look at the cutaways of them, it's powder, then there's room to put a wool wad in there, followed by a grease cookie, followed by the bullet. There's plenty of room inside of the case to get that nominally 68 to 70 grain, or in the case of Martini Henry, even 80 grain charge. Where the American Decision 4570, that cartridge is really small for what it's trying to do. So if you ever try to load a actual 4570 black powder, all right, with the bullet seated where it's supposed to be seated, you do have to plenty of compress, a lot of compression. So not something that's easy to do in the field, all right. But if you have a factory, and in America we've got factories, so they were able to mass produce the 4570 round. But its performance is very similar to the other rounds, right? So that's what I have. So any questions or corrections? Again, I have an audience of experts here. So. Questions? All right. Well, I guess we covered it, didn't we? All right. Well, thank you. And now it's show and tell time. This is like giving a lecture to professors. Yeah, I do that.
Who's next?
Oh,